Disinformation is a major threat to victory against Russian aggression in Ukraine, and around the world threatens information security and social stability. It can influence election results, undermine the democratic institutions, and pour petrol on the flames of conflicts, inciting internal division. Today, I'm discussing the mechanics and narratives of Russian information hybrid warfare with Oleksandra Tsekhanovska. Ukraine remains one of the main targets of Russian disinformation operations, which have three main directions: create an image of Ukraine as an enemy and obtain a social mandate to implement their aggressive imperialist policies; two, destabilize society and force it to sue for peace on Moscow's terms; and thirdly, legitimize Russian policy for an international audience and gain influence where it can. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. We aim to cover a range of issues around online propaganda and digital disinformation. If you enjoy the material we create, then please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos in YouTube, and do share our content with your network. Oleksandra is Research Officer at the Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group of the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. She works in building trust-based partnerships that enhance Ukraine's resilience to cyber warfare and disinformation. She is an information security expert with a focus on Russia. Oleksandra has acted as chief consultant to the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine on strategic matters of information security. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for having me. If I may, I'd like to boast a little bit and say that while I started as an analyst at Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group, I'm in fact proud to lead the department right now.
Oh, that's great news. Thank you so much. And of course, that really feeds into what we're going to be exploring today, which is the evolution of Russian propaganda narratives about Ukraine and how they're projected into the Ukrainian information space around the world. But before we get into that, I'd like to ask you, how did you get into this area of research and what attracts you to it?
I can't say that it was a conscious or rational decision at first, because I had a very personal experience of the influence Russian propaganda can have on people. And it happened in one of those decisive moments that every person has in their life. What I'm talking about is that when the Revolution of Dignity or Euromaidan Revolution was taking place in Ukraine, I was a student in the Kiev-Mohyla Academy, the National University in Ukraine. And for me, as well as for my fellow students and many other people of Ukraine, this was a moment where you realize that you're witnessing the nation in the building. And of course, it influences deeply Ukraine as a state, Ukrainian society as a whole, but it's also a deeply personal experience. You experience a lot of things, starting from incredible inspiration to rage and to fear, although we didn't have that much fear back in the time. Of course, this is something that you want to share. I used to have a lot of friends in Russia, and used to is a word that I'm using consciously here. And back when I was witnessing and actually taking part in the Revolution of Dignity, I felt it natural to share with them what was happening. And as you would expect your friends to reciprocate your feelings and to share the excitement, I was faced with a wall of lack of understanding. They did not want to understand me. They did not want to listen to me. And sometimes they would openly accuse me of being a liar. And it got me thinking, why would people believe that their friend, a person they knew for years, would be a liar? What is the version of truth that they believe then? And this is how I personally, in my conscious life as an adult, experienced the influence of propaganda and how it can poison and destroy minds.
And of course, that's really fascinating that you say this attitude goes back many years, actually. Because of course it's clear now, and many people now understand that, Russians disbelieve their own relatives when they say they're being bombed and shot at. But hearing that this attitude goes back even prior to 2014 is absolutely fascinating. And I think it says a lot about the Russian psyche and how they perceive Ukraine. I don't think they perceived this revolution as coming from a popular basis. I think many Russians are influenced not just by propaganda, but by what they want to believe themselves. And that is that somehow the US has orchestrated the whole thing, that it's an external pressure, it's not a democratic movement.
Yes, absolutely. There is a widespread belief that the Revolution of Dignity was not a popular uprising, which it was, but it was a US staged coup that was organized in order to conduct more successfully the so-called anti-Russian American policy, and basically use Ukraine as an anti-Russian platform. And you can hear this idea, this narrative of Ukraine being an artificial anti-Russian political project very much. But this is something that unfortunately a lot of Russians are inclined to believe. And this is why the propaganda has been so successful, because it is rooted in a very deep, unfortunately, tradition of perceiving Ukraine as a territory, but not as a state, as an entity that is not that does not have any agency of its own. Russians, unfortunately, keep seeing Ukraine through imperialistic lens, because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was absolutely zero work done to reassess the imperialist and totalitarian past. Nobody did anything in order to reevaluate this thing. And so the optics remained. These optics mean that Russians believe, the majority of Ukrainians, to already be inclined to be used by foreign power. And this foreign power should either be Russia, which is a power for good, or the US, which is the eternal enemy.
And doesn't it also play into some very deep Soviet propaganda myths that somehow, the Ukrainian language is comical, that somehow, Ukrainians are not as sophisticated? The very idea that Ukraine could have a much more sophisticated civil society, much more diverse, sophisticated political sphere, and actually a much more complex, interesting cultural evolution, all these things probably terrify most Russians.
Yes, absolutely. And the idea that Ukraine or any other state that used to be Russia's colony, for that matter, can have something that Russia doesn't have, or to be better at something than Russia is absolutely unacceptable. Because it violates the key principle of colonial politics and colonial optics. We are the bigger brother. We know life, we know stuff better than you do. And so you have to follow our lead because we are better than you. And then your lives will be comfortable. If you do not accept this obvious reality, then it means that something's wrong with you, or you have been tricked by someone. In this case, the collective West, as they like to call it, and of course, mostly the United States. So yes, here we go.
And I think what's really fascinating about this is, of course, for a period, at least in Moscow and St. Petersburg, Russia did make more economic progress, and to an extent, amongst a sort of nascent middle class, incomes did rise faster than they did in Ukraine for a while. I mean, we're going to 2012 here, so it's quite a long time ago. As Putin and the Russian elite saw that actually the sort of what they saw as the political chaos in Ukraine wasn't actually holding it back economically, there must have been a certain degree of panic. And I think it's no coincidence that this war coincides with the point that the average income in Ukraine was set to exceed that in Russia itself, and clearly the evolution of a professional, comfortable middle class was going to outstrip Russia. Do you think sort of politics and economics converge here to an extent as well?
I'm not a professional expert on economic matters, so I wouldn't want to disinform you, but there are a couple things I'd like to say. First of all, I would like to go back to the previous question and confirm that indeed there is a very long tradition of portraying Ukrainian culture as inferior to the Russian culture. This is a Soviet tradition, and why it was so successful? The answer is because this kind of propaganda was usually a covert one. So it was not openly political, and this idea was mostly promoted through art. If you take a look at the Soviet movies, you will often see that the Ukrainian character is funny, sometimes a bit foolish, sometimes sly, but in any case, Ukrainian characters would be absolutely incapable of doing anything, of succeeding in anything without the help of the Russian characters who were portrayed as a decisively positive force. So this kind of covert propaganda is very effective, and we can see that the beliefs that were shaped by this kind of approach in media, in art, are still very relevant to Russians today. And a lot of modern Russian propaganda is being built on that. Actually, if we talk about the pillars on which modern Russian propaganda and disinformation, because I firmly believe those are two different things, are built on, we can indeed take a look on the Orange Revolution and 2004, which was the first strike of panic in the Kremlin that something is definitely wrong in what they believe is their backyard, as they usually perceive Ukraine. And we can remember that it was after 2004 that the Putin's regime started going through some internal political processes, such as the formation of Nashi movement, for example, which was curated by Vladislav Surkov, who had built quite a career for himself in Russia and who later would be an architect of the Russian hybrid aggression against Ukraine. So Nashi, as well as the whole set of other measures, were designed to serve as a safeguard for Russian political elite from experiencing what Ukraine has experienced, because they believe that Orange Revolution was a threat. And since then, any democratic change in Ukraine has been perceived as an existential threat to Russia.
Much more important, isn't it, that particular point, than any point about NATO or EU accession? It's actually Ukraine providing a template for an alternative version of Russia that I think is the biggest threat.
Yes, absolutely. And frankly, I have observed a lot of debates, including debates between Western experts and Western public on the reasons behind the large-scale Russian aggression against Ukraine. And honestly, it strikes me how many people actually believe that Russia was provoked to attack Ukraine because of the alleged NATO expansion. This is lying directly from the Kremlin propaganda playbook, and it can be very easily debunked if we actually take a look at the messages, at the public statements of top Russian officials themselves. I mean, we have to carefully listen to a couple of Putin's speeches, as difficult as it is to do. We have to read a couple of posts on Telegram by Dmitry Medvedev, a former president of the Russian Federation. And obviously, we have to read a program article published in RIA Novosti called What Russia Should Do with Ukraine. These statements and this article in particular are a map for Russian policy towards Ukraine, which is clearly genocidal in academic sense of this word, because I know that people are skeptical when they hear this word, but actually what Russia has been doing fits the very academic framework of genocide. There is the idea to eliminate Ukraine as a sovereign nation, as a sovereign state, and to be ruled completely by Russians on Russian terms, so that even the idea of Ukrainian independence is eliminated. And this has always been key for the current Russian regime. This is the pillar on which they base their political approach to Ukraine. This is the actual reason behind the war. Even if there was no NATO, for example, even if Ukraine would be openly denied the possibility to ever join the alliance, which of course would be a great geopolitical mistake, Russia would still attack. Actually, if Ukraine was obviously and openly denied the possibility of membership in NATO, Russia would have attacked even faster.
And of course, we have to look at Russian actions, don't we? Of course, we know that from Syria and the experience in Chechnya, Russians have a long history of bombing hospitals, bombing refugee convoys. They've done this for many years. That's clearly a terror weapon. But in Ukraine, they are bombing universities, schools, cultural institutions, and the ordnance they're using is extremely expensive. There isn't really any tactical justification for destroying these places, and it costs millions and millions of rubles every time they do it. It can only really be explained from the lens of cultural genocide, can't it?
Yes, absolutely. And there was the discussion of one of the many terrorist attacks done by Russia against Ukraine I witnessed on Twitter. And there was this very good summary that can be roughly translated as they bomb our cultural institutions to say that we have no culture. They bomb our museums and our archives to say that we have no history. They bomb our people to say that we cannot live without them.
It's absolutely horrific. And I have to ask the question that you brought up earlier in our discussion, that you used to have professional relationships and even friendships with Russians within the professional community. I have to ask, have you received any messages of support at all from a single Russian, or have they been silent since February?
I have to say that I did not have professional relations with Russians, but I did have a lot of close personal friendships. I have relatives in Russia, as so many Ukrainians do. So out of approximately, I think, 20 people, only one person has sent me a message asking, hey, how are you doing? Are you okay? Are you at least alive? And it was a difficult conversation, but we talked a bit, and she understands what's happening fully, and she does not offer this kind of ambiguous position like, yes, war is horrible, but you shouldn't have provoked us, or не все так однозначно, it's not like we can fully understand what's going on. I do know that one of my relatives has reached out to another member of my family, and their message was very insulting, because they said they are worried about us, but we have to wait a little bit, and then we will be liberated from the fascist rule, and everything will be great, and we will all be friends again.
I mean, that's pure brainwashing, and I have some friends in Russia similarly, and some of them have actually early on in the war protested. I think now it's very difficult for them to do that, but I have to say, most have been silent. And we've had some fairly strong arguments with family members. So I completely appreciate that. You know, it actually, you know, what you've just said reflects very much on the statistics, which it's believed to be around 10% of Russians get their news via VPNs on the internet and have at least access to other sources of information. But of course, 10% is not nearly enough to create a critical mass to overturn policies or regimes. And of course, in Ukraine, you know, during the revolutions you were describing so eloquently earlier, a much, much higher percentage of the population was actively involved in those political movements, wasn't it? You know, more like sort of 30, 40%.
Yes, absolutely. But I have to say that in my personal opinion, in case of Russia, and probably in case of other countries too, exposure to truthful and objective information does not necessarily directly lead to political involvement and activism. Because of course, we do realize that censorship in Russia is growing rapidly, and it's becoming more and more difficult to get independent and objective information. But it's not like the situation was like this for 20 years. Russians had a lot of opportunities to get truthful information, including in Russian, like BBC Russian, for example, Настоящее время, current time, other sources. They had this information, and yet the overall level of political activism was rather low.
And this leads very well into the work you're doing at the Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group and the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Could you describe a bit about the organizations you're involved in, their sort of activities, and how you counter the sort of disinformation that is continuously thrown at Ukraine through various media channels?
It would be my pleasure to do a short introduction. I'll try to keep it brief because UCMC is actually Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Henceforth, UCMC is a rather big organization, and it was formed in March 2014 as sort of a first response in terms of communications to the Russian annexation of Crimea and the start of the hostilities in the eastern Ukraine. And back then, institutional capacities of Ukrainian state were considerably weakened. So the top communicators in the field basically came together and decided to create what was then perceived as a temporarily hub in order to help the state. And hence the name, the initial name, Ukraine Crisis Media Center, because we believed back then that we were dealing with a critical situation which is going to pass very soon. Of course, reality was very different. So over the time, UCMC evolved to have different teams who work with different target audiences, starting from regional journalists and editors of regional media to high schoolers and the students of university. And for example, to our department, Hybrid Analytical Group. Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group, which started out with 3 pieces of major quantitative research, where we purchased the database of Russian news and information political talk shows for 3 years and explored how exactly Russian propaganda used television as a very controlled environment in order to build disinformation narratives against Ukraine and against the West, and also how this led to the image of enemy. To the creation of the image of enemy. And basically this defined the further direction of our work, because we are not a fact-checking organization. We deal specifically with narratives as major building bricks of disinformation as a system. So there may be many different ways to promote, to adapt a given narrative, but identifying these stories, this interpretation of events is one of the most crucial things that a counter-disinformation expert has to do, in my opinion.
I think that is absolutely fascinating, because when you teach people about digital literacy, you can teach them certain techniques, But surely the most important thing is for people to try and feel or sense when they're hearing a sort of inherited narrative or a constructed narrative that's designed to change their minds, or when they're listening to a narrative that, you know, an individual has crafted and thought about for themselves. That's quite a complex thing to unpack, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely, because sometimes it is very difficult for people to do so, and for purely psychological reasons at that. We all are aware of confirmation biases that we have, other cognitive biases that we have. There is no denying that they influence our actions, the way we perceive information, the way we even find access to information, and filter bubbles and social media absolutely don't help. But the problem is, and this is one of the reasons why Russian disinformation has been rather efficient in its polarizing activities in the Western democracies, is that it always looks for actual grievances and social vulnerabilities on the ground. And this is why the issues and topics that it exploits in the United States would be very different from those that are exploited in Hungary, for example, or in Ukraine or in Poland. They adapt, but the overall mechanics basically remain the same. The problem is that because they are so good at finding the problems that people already feel are there and that people feel strongly about, it may be very difficult to understand that you are being exposed or that you are repeating a narrative that was crafted elsewhere. Because this is the problem. I'm sorry if I'm taking too long, but
Not
this
at
is a
all,
problem
no.
that I'm seeing, and it frankly terrifies me, with a lot of representatives of the leftist movements in the United States, but also in the European countries. They claim to be anti-imperialist, but Russian-Ukrainian war has been a test, and I feel like many of those people have failed this test miserably, because on practice, they turned out to be not anti-imperialist, but simply anti-American. And they absolutely failed to see the total neo-colonial nature of Russian aggression against Ukraine, and they, in an absolutely imperialist manner, exclude Ukrainian voices from the discussion because we as Ukrainians are saying things that they don't agree with. And of course, these people, these movements and organizations often repeat key messages of Russian propaganda. Why? Because these messages fit their framework of belief, and it is very difficult to persuade these people that they're actually parroting the messages carefully crafted in the Kremlin.
Absolutely. And we'll unpack some of those individual messages in a minute, but the one that is really gaining some ground in the last couple of days is this argument that somehow by arming Ukraine, the conflict is being prolonged. That if only, we would stop pumping weapons into the area, somehow there'd be some kind of miraculous resolution. And you can clearly trace that message directly back to the Kremlin, to Russian propaganda sources. But many of these sort of, maybe call it intellectual memes, if you were able to trace them back in a kind of, family tree, as it were, many of them would find their origins actually within Moscow and Kremlin propagandist channels.
Yes, that's right. Although I would say that this narrative has emerged not a couple of days, but actually a couple of months ago. So basically, the first major shifts in Russian disinformation and propaganda took place a couple of, from 1 week to a couple of weeks after the start of the large-scale invasion, when Russia obviously realized that the blitzkrieg has failed, and so they had to adapt their messages and find new approaches in order to target the Western audiences and Ukrainian audience as well, but that's a different topic for discussion. And we knew in the counter-disinformation community, as soon as discussions to send Ukraine weapons started emerging, we knew that this issue is going to be a heavy target for Russian propaganda. And of course it was. And I believe this is, again, a field where Russia so masterfully exploits the fears and traumas that individual societies have. For example, we cannot really claim that those German intellectuals who write open letters and call to stop supplying weapons to Ukraine, that they are paid by the Kremlin, or that they are diehard Putin's fans, for example. Maybe they are not. Maybe they are acting based on the collective trauma that German society has experienced, and it defines their actions to a certain extent. The problem is that Russia knows this, and they are going to use every vulnerability every democratic society has. And the only option for you to safeguard yourself is to reflect on your vulnerabilities before Russia does.
And I'd like to explore the mechanics of these evolving narratives. Is it true to say that Russia will throw out many, many different messages? Sometimes they're even conflicting between themselves, but they rapidly evolve narratives and they're constantly testing what works. Because if we look at it from a marketing perspective, the same messages, the same campaigns won't work with different audiences. So they're almost treating this like some kind of mass A/B test, to use the sort of terminology of a media campaign.
Yes, I would say that we can take two different approaches here based on two key features of Russian disinformation. So these features are first, systematic nature of Russian disinformation. It's constant. And the second feature is adaptability. And sometimes these approaches coincide and overlap. Sometimes different approach, different principle is more relevant to a certain situation. For example, there have been top Russian narratives about Ukraine. We have identified them. What are the key, most popular, crucial messages pushed by Russia for the foreign messages regarding, for the foreign audiences, sorry, regarding the war. But it doesn't mean that on a more tactical level, they don't mix and match. And this is something that they do. So here we can see a discrepancy between strategy and tactical level, because on tactical level, what you, Jonathan, have mentioned, the influx of conflicting messages is something that they do in very critical situations. And we have seen this before. It's not new. We have seen this with MH17. We have seen this with poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal. And we have seen this on several occasions after the start of the large-scale invasion of Ukraine. So this kind of approach, when they try to flood the information space with as many different messages as possible, sometimes mutually exclusive, usually takes place in very critical situations for Russia, critical for its reputation. And since February in Ukraine, it has been mostly related to terrorist attacks against civilian infrastructure.
And with these different propaganda narratives, is it also true to say that, you know, they might target different messages at different parts of the population in Ukraine, depending on whether people are primarily Russian speaking, whether their first language is Ukrainian, but they'll also change the kind of narratives that are being targeted at Western Europe compared to the Middle East, compared to India, China. They'll be testing and learning to different audiences around the world.
Absolutely, but these are two very big different blocks to discuss. If we talk about Ukraine specifically, yes, we can definitely see this adaptability of messages for different target audiences. For example, for those people who are unfortunate and survive the horror of Russian occupation, what do they say? They insist that Ukraine has forgotten them, that nobody is going back for them. They overstate the losses of Ukrainian armed forces. Of course, they portray armed forces of Ukraine as criminals targeting civilian population, etc. They usually do so in Russian language. For example, this is what we see in Kherson. This is what we saw in Mykolaiv. Sorry, not in Mykolaiv, in Mariupol, but Mariupol altogether is a monument to human suffering, and it's a different story. I lived in Mariupol for a bit when I was a child. They also try to reach audiences in Western Ukraine or in Central Ukraine. They try to target Ukrainian-speaking people. And by the way, I'd like to mention that it's not like people in the East speak only Russian, people in the West speak only Ukrainian. That's oversimplification and it's wrong. Yeah. What do they do to target Ukrainian-speaking people, for example? They try to find whatever problems we are having and use trolls, bots, fake accounts, for example, to drive the social divisions deeper. For example, the issue of internally displaced persons who are looking for accommodation in Western Ukraine. Other issues of social importance. So you see the approaches are very different. And obviously this also works on a larger level, on an international level. Messages that are being pushed in the Middle East are very different from those that are being pushed to the members of the European Union, for example. What do the French and German, especially German people, keep hearing? You have to get ready for winter because your government would rather you guys freeze to death than just lift the sanctions from Russia, which did nothing wrong, basically. People in the Middle East do not care a lot about Russian supplies of gas to the European markets. No, they are being targeted mostly with anti-Western, specifically anti-American sentiments. And the Global South, as a region where Russian propaganda is taking deep root and where the exposure is significant, is a very serious problem that I feel we as counter-disinformation community do not pay enough attention to.
And that's another strong propaganda narrative really targeted at the West, isn't it? Is that you've got all these sanctions, but they're not working. You know, the ruble is strong. It's harming you more than it's harming us. Why don't you just soften sanctions? You know, do yourselves a favor. And yet there are some very compelling studies now coming out of some American institutions that actually show that the sanctions are devastating on the Russian economy. That the rate of damage to Russian industry and indeed consumer comfort is escalating extremely rapidly, and that actually, rather than pulling back on sanctions, we should double down on them because they're incredibly effective. I mean, isn't it true that whenever Russian propaganda says something, all you have to do in your mind is reverse it? It's likely that the opposite of the propaganda message is the actual truth.
Never believe anything until the Kremlin denies it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. When it comes to countering these propaganda narratives, that's a big part of the work you do. What has proved to be most effective in terms of giving people immunity from this relentless propaganda?
If I were to select two key principles, I'd say that the first principle is adapting a network approach. And I'm saying this from the perspective of civic activist if you wish. So a person who represents organization with limited resources. We are not the government. We don't have the capacities that the government has. But as a representative of Ukrainian civic sector, I feel that it is very important to find people on the ground who can, if they learn properly, who can take the case further, who can influence their own networks. And this is why I firmly believe in working with regional media editors of regional media outlets. Ukraine is a big country, and this is very important for us. And I think it is very important elsewhere. You cannot do everything by yourself. You have to diversify, and you have to talk to people on the ground. You have to find allies, and even better, you have to build a network of allies. And the second principle is actually rather similar. It is also based on diversification. You have to understand that there is no universal message and there is no magic recipe. Your enemy is cunning, and they target different people with different means. And so the only response you can have is to also use different channels of communication, different messages appealing to different audiences, and you have to do so preemptively based on the study of your own vulnerabilities that, as I said, Russia is definitely going to exploit. Know your weaknesses, and this is the only way for you to become stronger.
And we've talked about Russian propaganda testing and learning and trying different messages, but isn't it also true to say that when they find messages that resonate, they repeat them endlessly? How important is repetition in the effectiveness of Russian propaganda?
It is very effective, and I doubt that I'm saying something new here, because repetition is known to be one of the basic and most important principles of propaganda. Any propaganda. Russians did not invent it, and I don't think that Goebbels invented it in the Nazi Germany, because this is how our brain works. The more we are exposed to a certain piece of information, the more likely we are to believe it. And of course, the wilder this information is, the longer it may take us to be subjugated to this belief. But ultimately, we are likely to fall. And people like to overestimate themselves. And this is a terrible, terrible mistake that we make, because we cannot overrule the functioning of our brain. And these functions are what so many propaganda principles rely on. Repetition is key, and it is particularly dangerous in modern media environment where there can be an illusion of choice. Take the TV market in Russia, for example, and market is obviously a wrong word here. You can watch one channel which will give you all the top narratives, and then you will switch to another channel and you will hear them in a slightly different form. And then you will watch Rent TV, which specializes in conspiracy theories. You turn it off, you go online, where you see Komsomolskaya Pravda, for example, publishing the exact same thing. You go on Twitter, on Facebook, and you see bots promoting and flooding the info space with the same messages. It's like an information ghetto that you're often not even aware of.
And to an extent, we observe that happening in the US from 2016 onwards. Yes, there are different media sources and people are, divided into camps. It's far less of that unitary information space you get in Russia. But we also see people who are plugged into Fox News, AON, Newsmax. It does create a ghetto of, say, alt-right information. And we see the same kind of brainwashing process where you can no longer have a conversation with people. They're unwilling for their sort of views to be challenged. So we see that same strategy at work in frighteningly in other parts of the world now as well.
We do, and I wish there was a solution, but unfortunately, I personally do not know of this solution. Why? Because this is a very complex problem, and of course, it is heavily exploited and sharpened, if I can say so, by propaganda, including by Russian propaganda, but there are other deeper societal problems here. For example, we can talk about the general decline of respect for expertise, for example. We see how people increasingly treat expertise on the political and social matters as something that anyone can have, as long as they are saying something that you like to hear. And of course, this has always been a problem to a certain extent, but I think that now the process is being facilitated, particularly because of the social media that turn all of us into influencers. And it facilitates the existence of echo chambers, filter bubbles, where we are locked along with our own views and only selective pieces of information that confirm these views. We can no longer, sometimes I think, have a conversation in the society. It's becoming increasingly difficult, and it's a psychological problem. It's a problem of the algorithms that social media use. It's a problem of corporate responsibility. So it's a whole set of problems, and Russian propaganda is an important factor, but it's not the only one.
And I think we forget, don't we, that whenever a new media technology emerges, it takes a long time for people culturally and psychologically to develop mechanisms of skepticism. So in the 1930s, we had the rise of radio, and it's often forgotten what role radio played both in Stalin's regime.
In Rwanda.
Yeah, absolutely. We can see that a bit in Bulgakov's Master and Margarita and the effect of technology that's described in there. But also, of course, the Nazi regime very effectively used radio to control people. And it's only after maybe even decades of being exposed to a medium that people develop the mechanism to be, skeptical. And then the emergence of television in the 50s. And we look at adverts from that period and how people could sort of believe the sort of junk they were being fed at the time. Again, it took decades to develop polyphony of narratives and skepticism. The same is probably true, even more so, of social media. The level of skepticism just isn't yet there, is it? People tend to believe the information that they're fed by their echo chamber.
They do, and unfortunately for all of us, even when those mechanisms of skepticism and critical approach towards a certain medium of communication are being developed on a collective level, it doesn't mean that they are there to stay, that, this battle is won and I can calmly go home. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. Situation may be different in different societies, and yes, people might have started treating radio, for example, more critically I don't know, in the 60s, in the 70s, when they were already having problem with the television. But again, take a look at Rwanda, where radio of the Southern Hills was the major platform to incite hate speech and genocide. And it has been scientifically proven, it has been measured that the number of murders was higher in the level where there was a better radio reception.
Which is horrific that you can find those correlations in data. And that, to an extent, is also reflected, isn't it, by the weaponization of religion. That's nothing new, of course, in Russia. And it is certainly understood that from the Stalin period onwards, you couldn't be in the hierarchy of the church without being a KGB agent. And it's well known that the current patriarch Kirill was a KGB agent. I mean, there's some doubt as to whether he even believes in God or anything that he's talking about. But it is true to say that the Orthodox Russian religion is being entirely weaponized. And that really is comparable to the Rwanda genocide, isn't it?
It is. And if we talk about the way Russia weaponizes church as an institution, well, obviously it's a whole area to delve into, but Russian Orthodox Church has been instrumental in securing and strengthening Putin's regime. It is consistently promoting the most important governmental policies. If we go back to the times when the COVID-19 pandemic started and we were just learning to live it, it was surprising to see how Russian church as an institution, there were individual exceptions, Russian Orthodox Church supported vaccination to 100%. They demanded it. Sometimes they would go so far as to say that if you don't get vaccinated, you will burn in hell. But then, if we take a look at their subsidiary in Ukraine, Moscow Patriarchate, Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate, it's legally, if we talk about law, that internal religious law that regulates relations between two entities, it is legally a subordinate of Russian Orthodox Church. Their position was very different. They openly opposed vaccination. They served as a platform for anti-vaccination conspiracy theories, and it was very beneficial to Russia to encourage Russian people to get vaccinated, and they failed miserably, by the way, with that, but to discourage Ukrainian people, to promote destabilization, to push for the rhetoric, you are abusing our religious rights if you make us do so. And this is just one example. If we talk about the role of religious institutions in the military actions, even the kinetic activities, back in 2014, the Moscow Patriarchate churches would occasionally be used by the Russian military, posing as pro-Russian separatists, to store weaponry. And this was happening in the eastern regions. In the western, again, they adapted and they were saying the godless West is trying to incite this fratricidal war between us and our fellow Russian brothers. So, yes.
And there's just two areas that I want to talk on, because I know we're running out of time. And I really want to address firstly, one of the real challenges of propaganda, and then lastly, talk a bit more about the digital ecosystem that is resisting that propaganda. The first thing, of course, is that until recently, channels like Russia Today have been pretty effective, and that's because they're not pure lies. They mix in truth with lies to the point where many people can't distinguish it. And I've heard a figure mentioned as a sort of 60-40 rule, sort of 60% relatively verifiable information. Often something like Russian Today would give voice to many alternative politicians and alternative points of view that are valid to explore, but then they'd mix it in with propaganda, probably less than the 60-40 rule. What is your feeling about this dangerous aspect of propaganda, which blends truth with lies in different proportions?
This is precisely what makes disinformation so effective and so dangerous. And I would say that 60-40 is even good odds for us. Sometimes even 10% of lies combined with 90% of truth can be very dangerous, because this mixture is mostly aimed at people who at least try to think critically, people who have education, people to try to search for alternative points of view and they often fall into this trap. And even 100% of truthful information can also be misused, because context manipulation is a very important thing. For example, you can have a channel that will consistently report on every protest that is happening, for example, in France, and not a single protest would be made up, not a single photo or video would have been manipulated, but this would be the only topic that you are focused on. And I wonder what kind of the image of France people who regularly watch this channel would have.
That's exactly right. It's a form of editorial bias, isn't it? Which equally Russia can turn around and point to the Western media and say, well, you're also biased. You know, your media is owned by individuals. They have their own political bias. It's no different from what we do. I think that's massively challenging. And, you know, just simply banning them also creates a bit of a martyr kind of complex. So that really fits in with my last question here, which is what you're doing and the efforts that you've described to explore propaganda narratives and how they evolve. How does your work fit in with the wider ecosystem of digital resistance to tyranny and the war? We know that in the West, Bellingcat is quite well known and is extremely active, but it seems to me that Ukraine is pioneering a whole range of techniques and testing different strategies to oppose disinformation narratives.
Our strength in this area is trust-based partnerships and diversification. Ukraine has, as I'm sure you know, a vibrant civic society and expert community, and we know each other. Most of us know each other pretty well. We talk to each other, we listen to each other, and we try to divide our activities so that we do not really have substantial overlaps, but so that all the important blanks are being covered. It is also important that we at least strive for the one voice policy, and I feel that the Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security, that is basically the key governmental body in the area of information security in Ukraine, as an institution, it enjoys great trust and cooperation with civic society. So we know our strengths. We also know our weaknesses. And as I keep saying, this is very important. We diversify, we strengthen and empower each other, and we try to aim for one voice, but to work with different audiences, allowing each of us do best what we have set out to do.
And is it important that in Ukraine, you not only have these sort of government-supported initiatives, but there are also a lot of private initiatives, aren't there? And there's a certain amount of entrepreneurship when it comes to testing different actions. They don't always work, but do you think that horizontal approach that you have in Ukraine ultimately is going to prove more powerful than the strictly vertical approach that the Russian system adopts?
Well, I wouldn't ultimately say that I'm 100% sure that our approach is the best one and is applicable everywhere, because one thing that is very important about strategic communications, and we are talking about strategic communications here, is that context is everything. So Ukrainian context is very specific, and in our circumstances, vertical approach would be the most miserable failure, the biggest mistake that you can ever make. And I have a feeling that for a lot of Western democracies who value freedom and personal entrepreneurship, this also would be the case. I am actually more inclined to believe that democracies, despite having their problems, are more effective. And I mean democracy as a form of social organization, democracy as a network, democracy as a horizontal social entity, even on the, not on the level on the state, but on the level of organization, for example. In my experience, this it's not just that horizontal model works better than the vertical model. In my experience, horizontal model is the only one that actually works.
Absolutely, a kind of creative chaos where different strategies are tried and tested, some work, some don't, but that continual ability to innovate. And I think we're probably out of time. I think we've got such a lot to learn from the way Ukraine has been forced to innovate. I know this hasn't happened by choice. You've been forced to innovate to survive, but I think we have so much to learn from you, and I'm extremely grateful that you've made so much time to speak with me today. The work you're doing is innovative, inventive, and clearly extremely important to push back against Russian digital hybrid warfare. And I wish you luck in your ongoing research and efforts. Slava Ukrainian.
Героям слава! Thank you for having me.